In the ancient Mediterranean world, sickness rarely looked like a single clear enemy. Pain came and went, fevers rose and broke, a person weakened and nobody knew why. Early healers reached for what they could actually observe: fluids. Sweat, mucus, urine, and especially blood seemed to change with health and crisis. So illness started to look like something inside the body that had shifted, thickened, or turned bad. Once disease felt like a problem of fluids, treatment followed the same logic. Herbs and prayers stayed common, but they often worked slowly or not at all, and their effects felt hard to prove. Bleeding offered something different. It produced an immediate, visible result. If a patient looked flushed, restless, or feverish, removing blood seemed like removing heat or pressure. Harm at last appeared to leave the body in a measurable way. The first experiments with bleeding did not look like a unified medical system. They looked like practical trials, repeated when they seemed to help and copied when they fit a familiar story. A cut, a puncture, a leech, and then a watched reaction. Sometimes a patient calmed, sometimes they collapsed, and the lesson stayed unclear. But the procedure itself felt powerful. In a world of invisible causes, bloodletting made medicine feel real. In classical Greece, medicine shifted from scattered remedies toward a system that claimed it could explain nearly every illness. Physicians linked health to 4 key fluids in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When a person looked feverish, weak, or restless, the problem sounded simple. One fluid supposedly rose too high, another fell too low. Balance meant health, imbalance meant disease. This idea made bloodletting feel less like a gamble and more like a calculation. If illness came from excess, then removing something could restore order. Blood became the easiest target because it was visible and reachable. A doctor did not just hope for relief, he claimed he corrected a measurable problem. Bleeding was framed as release, as pressure reduction, as clearing what was spoiled. The theory gave the cut a reason. Once bloodletting sat inside humoral theory, it stopped being occasional. It became a tool with an explanation ready in advance, even when the outcome stayed uncertain. Different symptoms got translated into the same logic: too hot, too full, too inflamed, too agitated. The answer often pointed back to the vein. A simple act draining blood now carried the authority of a whole medical worldview. In Rome, bloodletting stopped being an improvised idea and became a procedure with rules. The turning point came through Galen, a famous physician whose writings carried enormous weight. He treated bleeding like a controlled tool, not a guess. He organized illness into patterns, then matched each pattern to a specific kind of bleeding. Once those instructions spread, many doctors stopped debating whether to bleed and started debating how to do it correctly. The new playbook answered practical questions that decided who lived and who collapsed. It spelled out when bleeding made sense and when it did not, down to timing, strength, and symptoms. It told practitioners where to open a vein for different complaints and how much blood counted as enough. It even treated the patient's age and body type as part of the calculation. Standardization created confidence. It also created permission. Because the method looked orderly, it felt safe, even when the results stayed uncertain. A doctor could point to the rules and claim the treatment was measured and rational. If a patient improved, bleeding got the credit. If a patient worsened, the assumption often became that the illness was too strong, or the bleeding came too late, or not in the right place. The framework protected the practice. It made bloodletting harder to question. In late antiquity, empires fractured, cities shrank, and long-distance learning broke apart. But bloodletting did not vanish with the old order. It travelled in smaller, tougher containers. Hand-copied texts, short practical manuals, and routines passed from teacher to student. The technique looked simple, and it fit the dominant logic of sickness. When institutions fell, habits survived. Bleeding stayed available when almost nothing else felt dependable. Monasteries became quiet centers of care, not because they mastered new science, but because they organized daily life. Monks treated fevers, swellings, headaches, and lingering pain with the tools and ideas they had. Bloodletting slipped into schedules like a maintenance task, paired with diet, rest, and prayer. In royal courts, it carried status, a controlled procedure used to show that illness was being managed. Authority protected it, and repetition normalized it. Outside institutions, ordinary people absorbed the same logic. If sickness meant dangerous excess, then removing blood felt like action instead of waiting. Local healers and household caretakers learned when to open a vein, how to time it with seasons, and how to read weakness as proof the body had been relieved. That was the trap. Some patients improved by chance, others faded from the loss. Either way, the practice became routine, and routine looked like truth. In the medieval world, bloodletting stopped being something you needed a learned physician to supervise. A new kind of medical worker took over the hands-on cutting, the barber-surgeon. Barbers already handled razors, so they also handled skin. They pulled teeth, lanced boils, stitched wounds, and opened veins. That shift mattered. It meant bleeding moved from elite theory into everyday service, offered wherever people lived and travelled. As the job spread, the tools changed too. Simple knives gave way to purpose-made instruments that made bleeding faster and easier to repeat. Scarificators created multiple shallow cuts at once. Cupping glasses used suction to draw blood to the surface and then out through small incisions. Spring-loaded lancets delivered a quick puncture with less hesitation. These devices lowered the skill barrier. More practitioners could do it, and more patients could access it. With that accessibility came scale. Bloodletting no longer depended on rare appointments or scholarly debates. It became a routine option in markets, towns, and villages. People asked for it for fevers, headaches, swelling, and weakness because the action looked immediate and decisive. The barber-surgeon delivered a visible procedure with a clear endpoint. The blood had left the body. And once a treatment became easy to buy, it became hard to question. Renaissance medicine shifted when anatomists began cutting into human bodies and mapping what they actually found. Old ideas did not disappear, but they bent. Blood no longer sounded like just one of several fluids drifting out of balance. It started to look like a moving substance with roots and pressures. That changed the logic of bleeding. Doctors bled to unload the system, to quiet a racing pulse, to ease pain that they linked to congestion. At the same time, Europe faced outbreaks that did not fit comfortably into the old medical playbook. Syphilis spread and terrified communities, and physicians searched for treatments that seemed decisive. Bloodletting offered a familiar action when causes stayed mysterious. Fevers, rashes, swollen glands, sudden weakness. Many of these signs looked like the body boiled over. So doctors opened a vein to release what they imagined as heat, poison, or excess, even when the real enemy was an infection. Each crisis pushed the practice further. When a patient briefly calmed after bleeding, that moment felt like proof, even if collapse followed later. New anatomy gave bloodletting fresh language, and new diseases gave it fresh urgency. It became a tool that could be fitted to almost any explanation. Balance, blockage, inflammation, contamination. The result was simple and powerful. Bleeding looked adaptable, and adaptability looked like truth. So the cure survived, and it spread. By the 1600s, bloodletting no longer sat on the edge of medicine. It sat at the centre. Doctors treated it as a mark of training and authority, a visible action that proved something was being done. Patients expected it, families asked for it, and when a practitioner reached for the lancet early, it signalled confidence, not doubt. Doing nothing looked careless. Bleeding looked professional. Hospitals adopted that mindset and turned it into routine. Sick people arrived with fevers, coughs, pain, confusion, and weakness, and many left with less blood. Records and teaching followed the same pattern. Bleed, observe, bleed again. The practice scaled because it was fast, repeatable, and easy to standardize. It fitted the hospital ward like a checklist, and it created a simple story of control over illness. Armies pushed it even further. Military medicine needed treatments that traveled well and seemed decisive under pressure. So bleeding accompanied soldiers through camps and campaigns used for wounds, infections, and sudden collapse. It spread with European power into colonies, where the same rules followed ships, forts, and field hospitals. At that scale, bloodletting became more than a choice. It became a system, one that could drain thousands on command. In the early 1800s, bloodletting did not fade. It intensified. Doctors bled patients earlier, more often, and in larger amounts, convinced that speed and force meant control. Fevers, pneumonia, infections, childbirth complications, even ordinary weakness could all lead to the same response: open a vein. For many physicians, the most decisive doctor still looked like the one who drained the most. The practice also moved into the spotlight. Prominent people fell ill. Famous doctors treated them, and aggressive bleeding became a public spectacle of medical confidence. Then outcomes began to clash with expectations. Some patients grew pale, faint, and confused. Some never regained strength. Families watched a treatment meant to save life seem to pull it away, drop by drop, and questions started to spread. Reports accumulated in hospitals and homes. Patients worsened after repeated bleeding, and some died after being drained when they had little reserve. Doubt did not arrive as one discovery. It arrived as unease, case after case that felt wrong. Even inside the profession, whispers turned into arguments about limits, timing, and necessity. The old certainty began to crack, not from theory, but from what people kept seeing. By the mid-1800s, a quiet shift happened in medicine. Some clinicians stopped leaning on tradition and started counting. Hospitals created records that tracked diagnoses, treatments, and outcomes. Death rates and recovery times became numbers that could be compared. This changed the question. It no longer sounded like, did bleeding make sense in theory? It sounded like, did it actually help real patients? With those records, doctors began lining up groups of similar patients and asking what happened when one group got bled and another did not. The results kept pointing the same way. People who were bled often recovered more slowly, fainted, or slipped into dangerous weakness. Some died who might have lived. When the totals were added up, the promised benefits failed to appear. These controlled comparisons did not just challenge a treatment, they challenged a whole habit of thinking. Once hospital statistics showed harm again and again. Confidence cracked. Younger physicians used the numbers as a weapon against old routines, and hospitals adjusted their protocols. Bloodletting did not vanish overnight, but its authority collapsed. For the first time, lack of benefit carried more weight than tradition. By the time the old practice faded, it did not vanish completely. It shrank. In modern hospitals, doctors still removed blood, but only for specific conditions where the body held too much of it or held too much iron. This was called therapeutic phlebotomy. It was not meant to balance mysterious forces. It targeted a measurable problem, and the goal was a clear physical change the body needed. That difference mattered because modern medicine no longer treated blood as a symbolic fluid that carried illness away. It treated blood as data. Doctors measured oxygen, iron, hormones, infection markers. They asked what organs did and what went wrong when those functions failed. Bleeding stopped being a default response because physiology explained the damage it caused. Less blood meant less oxygen, weaker circulation, and less chance to recover. The final barrier was not tradition, but proof and responsibility. Treatments had to survive clinical trials, not reputations. They had to help more than they harmed, and patients had to consent, not submit. Bloodletting remained only where evidence showed benefit and safer options did not. The same action that once looked like healing now looked like risk, unless careful testing said otherwise. That reversal marked the distance from the ancient worldview.